So you can bind one event to multiple URLs, and that's also the big plus for the webhooks. So you create for one message, you send that data to numerous other systems, like we have system 1, 2, and 3 here. And it's really cool that we can do it with just configuration. Anybody, whoever configured the plugin, can do the webhook part too, if you have the endpoint that will handle uh, the actual event. How can we configure the webhook? So the configuration is done via plugin registration tool, and you must all be familiar with that when you are registering any kinds of plugins or workflow activities. Uh, but the thing is, most of the people use the XRM Toolbox version of plugin registration tool. You need to download actually the plugin registration tool from NuGet or from XRM Tools, now known as CDS Tools. It's a web page where you can just hit the download button and you will get a zip file that contains all the tools that you need, which one of them is plugin registration tool. The configuration is very easy, few steps, and you have your webhook ready to go. As I said, it's almost the same way as you do it with plugins. You just need to add the endpoint part to the webhook, and it's pretty much the same configuration as you would do with a plugin. Here is the screenshot. How can you do it? There is a register button, and you will need to pick register a new webhook from the list. You will get the pop-up that you need to input the endpoint, and after that you just add numerous messages underneath that webhook that you want to trigger that endpoint. So for example, you can have one endpoint that will handle create, delete, and update of account record. How easy is that? It's really cool. There are two webhook types, just like the plugins, asynchronous and synchronous. So the async one is logged as async operation job. Just like any other async process in the CDS, you can see all the executions. If you tick the checkbox, you can even force that all the successful calls are also logged into the system, and you can go to settings, system jobs, and browse and see all the executions of your webhooks. But the sad thing is that there you won't find any I don't know message that will point you to the error. That really sucks if you ask me. But at least you can have some triggers that will warn you that you have failed jobs. If you go the synchronous route, all the codes from your endpoints tagged as OK created, so the 200 range will result in success. All the other codes for invalid service or something like that will result in failed. When the synchronous webhook fails, it will just roll back the transaction done in the CDS. For example, if you're creating an account, you get a 500 response code, it will just roll back the transaction. The error dialog that pops up is not customizable, will not show you the exact error that is happening on the endpoint side, and you need to search that on where you stored your endpoint or your web API handler. There is also a 60-second timeout and synchronous, so your webhook logic must end in 60 seconds, otherwise it will go in timeout and also do a rollback on the transaction. But if everything goes right, if you got 200 range response code, you will get three parts of the request. So it's basically the post body will contain, sorry, the post the request will contain a query string where you can have a webhook key. That's basically the Azure Functions key that will do the authorization, or the HTTP query string that can hold various values that can be configured while you're configuring your webhook in the plugin registration tool. In the header, you will get the event data, where did it come from which environment, and stuff like that. And the request body will have all the data that you need to process your event. For example, you create an account, and you in the request body you will get just the same execution context that you get in your plugins. You will have that target node that will contain all the attributes that were sent in your event. For example, the account name. If you create an account, you will find the account name in the attributes of the target node. Let's have a look on the remote execution context structure. So there are lots of properties that you can read from the remote execution context, but the most interesting ones are input parameters, post entity image, and pre-entity image. So all the input parameters will go, that will be the most interesting node for you to look in. There is a target node also there that will hold all the data that you need and everything else that you want to use. You can also create a pre and post entity images like in plugins and get the data from those images too. The HTTP header part will have those keys that you see on the left, and the most interesting one is organization name. So here you can have organization name that send the event. So you can have one handler that is handling or doing the business logic for multiple organizations, and you will always know from which organization is the request is coming. Okay, so that's the basic structure of the webhooks. And now let's jump into the demo, and I will show you how to do the basic configuration of the webhooks. Okay, so the first thing you need to do is go to CDS Tools, and here you have get the CDS Tools link. Click there, and you can go here, download the SDK zip file. So basically it will download all the tools you need for the webhook configuration. After you download the zip, you will get the tools in the export folder, and you just need to run plugin registration tool as you would do in the plugin development. Okay, I logged in to my environment, and I want to register a webhook. So go to register new webhook. Okay, and here you have the webhook configuration. Now we don't have really an endpoint, but there are numerous pages that will that can be used to actually inspect that request coming from the CDS webhooks. One of them is request bin. So you go to the requestbin.com and you go, I don't want private, create request bin. When you create your first request bin endpoint, you will have your endpoint here. And as you can see, this page is waiting for the request to come to that endpoint. So just copy the URL, paste it in the endpoint URL. Let's say sample webhook. Okay. And you can choose any of these because in this scenario, it will not be used, but when we go to the Azure Functions part, we will use the webhook key, and I will just type something here just to show you how it's working. Okay, click Save. And after the save is completed, you will have the new webhook part here, where you can just register a new step, like you would do on assembly when you are doing a plugin. Okay, register a new step. I will go create message on the entity that I will use in these demos is project. Okay, and let's say that it's synchronous and everything else left as default. Okay, register new step. And when the registration is completed, boom, we have our first webhook up and running. So we will now test it. And how can we test it? Of course, we go into our Power App and go to that project entity that we created a step for it. Okay, let's go new and let's create a project live demo. Okay, and hit save. If you configured everything okay, webhook will execute with no errors. And how can we see what's coming from that webhook? So now we have a new request coming on our endpoint. We can click on it and we can see what's inside it. Let's first go through headers. As I said, we have entity name, so it's coming from project entity on my organization called Dynamics Ninja. Okay, and it's a create message. There are pretty interesting part of information that you will use in your processing, so keep an eye on it. And the big part is body part, and the body will contain all the things you are normally seeing in your plugins, in the execution context of your plugins. So it's basically JSON that contains the plugin registration context coming from the CDS. If we go to input parameters, target, and we can find the name attribute here, and as we can see, we got the live demo from our record created here. So with that, we can see that our webhook is working, and now we can talk about it, how we can improve that webhook and how we can write our own event handlers for our webhooks. Let's go back to the presentation for this part. Okay. And my weapon of choice would be Azure Functions. It's a serverless service that allows you to create a simple pieces of code that will execute somewhere in the cloud that has ability to auto scale. So for example, it will just auto scale if you bombard the endpoint with a lot of requests. It has multiple triggers, but in our case, the most important one is HTTP, because we'll get a post out of our webhook and we need to process that post request. You can do the function in various programming languages. I hope that most of you are familiar with C# and most of the functions that you will write will be C# because it's almost the same thing that you do in plugins. And if you need to do some complex stuff, there is also powerful extension called durable functions. If the normal function runtime is not enough, you can do some crazy stuff, complex calculations that are calling all other functions with durable function extensions. We could talk about durable functions in a separate session because it's really complex stuff. And The most important part here is Azure Application Insights. The Insights is integrated into functions. You can have your log from the functions on one place. That is really great. It's free up to 2 GB of storage or something like that. I encourage you to use it because this will be the place where you would go when you want to find what's failing on your function. You can see the logs, you can search from there, and it's really awesome. There are 2 ways of developing Azure functions. The most basic one is inside the Azure portal, but that's not a way that developers do it. If you have some basic functions, you can probably do the logic inside the portal, Azure portal, but at the end you want some ALM on top of it and all the things you have in the modern IDEs. So my preferred way would be using some editors. You can do it in Visual Studio, whether it be original Visual Studio or Visual Studio Code. You can do it in both, and both are integrated with Azure Functions really good. So you can do all the publishing just right from the actual IDE. And now we're going to demo part where we will build Azure function that will handle our request and do some processing inside. Let's open up Visual Studio, and I have one function created here. So basically, when you create a HTTP trigger function, you can let me show you. You go add a new Azure function. Azure function, let's add. You can select various triggers. In our case, you will need HTTP trigger because it will process our HTTP requests. Also, the point that we need to mention here is when you are creating an Azure Functions project, you need to keep an eye on this dropdown. So Azure Functions version 1 are running on .NET Framework, and if you would use, for example, CDS SDK inside your function, you should, at a moment, I will suggest to use .NET Framework because Azure Functions 2 are built on top of .NET Core. For example, SDK for CDS has the .NET Core version, but it's still in alpha version. It has some bugs. It is developing month to month, but it's still not yet there. So if you will use the SDK, I suggest you to go on the .NET version. Okay, so let's have a look on this code. First of all, guys, can you see the code well, or do I need to zoom it in? Is it fine?
Please zoom a little bit.
Okay. Okay. Here we go. So we are creating one function that will receive the JSON payload. The JSON payload is the body of the function, that execution context from your webhook. So the first thing here, we are doing the log function here just to log the payload so we can examine it later. So we have here a function that is transforming that JSON to the actual object. The interesting part here is there is a function in request that allows you to serialize back to the object, but in this case, when you need to transform it to the remote execution context, it's actually not working. And most people are having troubles here when they try to make the object from the JSON, and that method is just failing. And how can you do it? You can do it the old-fashioned way using data contract serializer. So we are just passing the JSON string here, serializing it into the object, and boom, we have our object here. And now we can use the pretty IntelliSense to get our data from the context. Okay, so as I said, there is a input parameter target on the create message that will hold the entity for us. And after that, we can search up for the attribute. As we saw in our example, it's called name, and it's a project name. We're just logging that info so we can see it in the Azure portal later. And I put the exception here. Just if you use Salesforce into the project name, it will throw an exception just to show you how the the functional behavior when there is an exception, and that it's not the prettiest part of the webhook integration. And at the end, there is a GitHub service part where it just calls the simple GitHub API to create a repository on GitHub. And if everything is doing fine, it will just send us created response code, and it will end successfully. Okay, so now we want to publish this function to the Azure and try it, and how does it work. Okay, we go publish, and when the publish is completed, we can switch to the Azure portal. Okay, and now we switch to the Azure portal, and I already pre-built that app here, function app here. And when we open that app, if the publish is completed, we'll see that we have our create GitHub repo function in the function lists. And I don't know why it's loading so slow. Demo gods must be on my side, I think. Yeah, okay. Now we have the functions part here. Click on the functions part, and it will bring us the list of all the functions that we have inside our app. We should have only one function, because in the Visual Studio project, as you can see, we have only one function here, and we didn't create any other function. But it's so slow. When I tried it before, it was lightning fast. So here's our function. Go to that function, and here you can see on the left the monitor part. That's the interesting part, because here you can monitor the executions of your functions. And I think the latest addition is live monitor, so you can see all the requests coming live to your function, and all the traces that you write on your function, you will have all the traces straight away. So if we go monitor, we will just open it because we will use it later. And here you can go to the code plus test part, the overview, because every function has its URL that is generated by Azure and that you can use inside your webhook configuration. You can see that this button that is not enabled at the moment, but it will become enabled shortly, I think. And when we get it running, we can get the URL. Okay, here we go. And we have the URL to our function here. Now, what we will do, we'll go to our webhook, just disable this step so we don't send data to the request bin anymore. and register one more webhook. Now we name it Azure functions, and we should paste the URL here. The thing here is you should paste it part by part. So the first part is till the name of your function. You go here and paste it as is, and you just need to add HTTPS just to make it work. And the second part is webhook key, and the webhook key is located here. The code parameter here, you just grab it and paste it into the webhook key part. I didn't do the copy part. Okay, just to be sure. Okay, just paste it. Okay, now we have it. Save. And okay, now we have our second webhook. Also, we will just register the same message. So create on project and run it as synchronous. Okay, register new step. Boom, we have our Azure Functions webhook all set up. Let's go back to the application and let's try to create a new project and see if our function is working. Okay, so we go to the projects and hit new and create Azure function test project. Oh, sorry, test. Okay, here you go. Hit save, and now if everything is working, it will trigger our Azure function in Azure, and the GitHub repository with this name will be created on my GitHub. So if I go to my GitHub and see if the repository is created, okay, so show more. As you can see, the Azure function test repository is created, so our function is working just fine. And how can we how can we examine what's happening on in our function? Okay, here we go. Just to open that live monitor thing that will show us all the data that came through our function, so we know what's going on, because we put some log messages. So if you see here log info, so we will just log our JSON that is coming through and the project name just to be sure. Okay, and when it's loaded, we can examine those executions and see the values that are coming through. Oh, it's so slow today. What's happening? If you want, you can also examine that requests here in the list. Is that the latest one? Oh, yeah, it is. We can just click here, okay, and open this one. And now on the right, well, why is that not showing the data? Oh, sorry for that. I clicked the wrong X button. If it will not be fast, I think we should skip that part and go to the other part of the demo because it will take too much time. Yeah, basically, if you click on the request here, you will just see the log messages and what they, the values that they held. Okay, it's not loading so fast, so let's go to the next part. So if you want to debug those webhooks, it's pretty hard if you don't know some tricks. Uh, the thing is that the request is coming from the cloud and its destination is also in the cloud, and you can basically intercept the message to see what's happening in the process. And what you need to do here is you can log the content. For example, like we did, we trace the JSON, so you can fetch that JSON, put it in some tool like Postman, and recreate the request coming from the CDS in Postman and post it to your endpoint. And that way you can reproduce the same request, but I think it's so time consuming. You should not really do this, and you need to have a better solution for that. It's too much manual work. I should definitely not recommend it. But how can we do that? We need to expose our local machine to the internet and bind it back to bind our webhook to our local machine. That's a lot of configuration on the firewall side, on forwarding, and it's also not worth it that way. But the great thing is that we have a tool that helps us do this with a single click. So we have ngrok. And what is ngrok? It's a CLI tool that allows us to create an express tunnel between one cloud, so the CDS, to our local machine. Fully secured HTTP tunnel directly to our local machine with just one simple command. And that's really great tool to debug webhooks. And now I will show you how you can actually use that ngrok tool to debug the original requests coming from the CDS directly on your local machine. So let's jump into the demo part for ngrok. So basically you go to ngrok.com and download the tool. Okay, so ngrok.com, and here you have a big download button. Just download the tool. And the important part is when you install it, if it's not added in your path environment variable, please do it, because it will just make your life easier, because you will not have to always call it from the directory where you install it. They suggest to, okay, let's open the command prompt and let's type ngrok. So port 80 HTTP. So this command will open the tunnel between our sorry, it's the other way around. Okay, so 80, it will open the tunnel between the cloud and our local machine. So it generates URL that can be fixed if you go for a paid plan, but I'm on a free plan, and the URL is generated every time differently. But if you know the function app, when you're debugging it locally, it's not running on the port 80. And if we try to run our function project locally, we will get command prompt of the functions and see the port where we need to make tunnel to. When this will be started, we'll see the URL that we need to call to actually call our function locally, and the port that we need to add in our ngrok configuration to make the tunnel. Okay, it's slowly starting, but let's hope we'll have it running in no time. Okay, come on function. Run it. Okay. When this is running, I want to show you how you can save your time using ngrok 2. So for example, you want to configure your ngrok to always use the same configuration for debugging functions. There ngrok configuration file located in your users folder, and then .ngrok2, and here you can find um, one document that we will just open with Notepad just to see the contents of it. Okay, so I opened Notepad several times. Okay, so here, and that's the auth token that is automatically generated when you create your account, and the region is EU, and here is the list of tunnels. So the tunnel is basically the configuration that you want to execute your ngrok for. So I created a function tunnel and describe it as HTTP. So it will use HTTP protocol, and it will also generate HTTPS part. I want to run it on this port because if our functions didn't start it yet, you can find that port, and the functions project will run on the 7071 port all the time. And the final part is host header. If you don't use that host header that is bound to your local host, you can have problems. It's not always the case, but in some configurations it is required. So please use that as a request a host header if you want everything run smoothly while you are debugging it locally. Something is going on in our function project, but it's kind of picking up really slow. But here you see that your that a function is listening on that port. So we did it here. When we save that configuration, we can run the exact configuration just by typing ngrok start which tunnel. We created a tunnel called functions, and when we execute that command, it will just pick all the things we created there in our configuration and configure the tunnel just in the right way. So we can see that it's now bound to our localhost port 7071, and it generated some URL for us. Okay, let's check on the functions. Finally, we can see that we need to call localhost API/create GitHub repo to call our function. And how can we now call our function locally from the CDS? So we need to make sure that we take this URL, copy it, go to our webhooks. So I will disable this one too and create a new one that will be used only for our local debugging. So register new webhook. So local webhook. Okay. Paste that endpoint, and the function is running on the root API slash and the name of the function. Function name can be found here. Okay. Go here and paste it. Okay, and for the debugging purposes, you just type something here. It doesn't matter. Okay, and now we have a new local webhook. Register step. Again, create on project and register step. Okay, now we have registered the step. If everything is running just fine, we will hit the debugger in our local environment. Let's check if that's working. Go to the project, create some new. So new project, go to name and type local webhook. Okay, save, and Boom. Okay. So we hit our breakpoint. We can check the console of ngrok, and we have the post request coming to this route. And isn't it wonderful? You can now debug the stuff coming from the cloud directly on your local machine. So if you just go through the debugger, you go, how I want to read context here. Okay, just F10, and here we have the context. Okay, we can just go through the debugger and see all the values that we need and stuff like that. But when we want to retest something with the same data, it's also available from the ngrok side. Let's say, okay, we want to just continue and let it do the logic. Okay, and let's say we are not satisfied with the request. We want to test it again, and we don't need to um, create a new project with exact same configuration. We can just rerun the same request. As you can see here, we got endpoint unavailable. That's actually a result of the timeout. We were debugging more than 60 seconds. You will get that every time you debug for more than 60 seconds, you will get that error. But for the debugging purposes, it's just fine. If you go to that ngrok interface, you see this URL. Just copy it and paste it into your browser. When we open that, we can see that the UI is quite the same with the tool we used before. So we have a request bin that we used before just to log our requests, that has the exact same structure as our ngrok interface. So we have our post request that we sent with the first debugging session. Okay, and we can see all the values passed by. And now we want to just rerun this. Okay, we want to test it again. We just hit replay and go back to our debugger, and boom, you have the same, just the same request sent directly to your local function. That's really great when you are stuck in some serious and complex debuggings. You don't need to execute the create by your own. You can just hit reply, and you can have your request there. The other thing that I didn't show you is the part that, okay, we can just stop this one, is what happens when the webhook fails. And I wanted to show you that you can't easily get what's going wrong with the webhook just from the CDS dialog that will pop up. So just disable this step so we'll not get bothered. Okay, go here, and we did in the function this part that will show example if the Salesforce is contained in the name. Okay, let's create Salesforce project, for example, and hit save. When we hit save, the error will pop up, and if you look at this error, you will not understand anything. You will just be confused. Oh, my webhook is not working. No, your webhook is working perfectly fine, but there is some exception in your webhook, and you need to search for the information somewhere else, because if you go for details, you get error code, nothing really that you can use here. You can download error logs And when you open the error log, there is also no information that will point you to the right direction, what you need to fix in your webhook handler, so the function part. Let's try to demo the part that I wanted to show you before, where you can see those things, and that's the insights part of the functions. But if I keep that loading so slow, I'll sadly need to end the session without it. Okay, let's try one more time. We have 5 more minutes. But basically all the things that you can see here. So here there is a delay of those messages coming through here to 5 minutes. So you need to wait for 5 minutes to see the actual result. But here you see all the things that we logged on our side in the function just right from the interface. If you run the live metrics dashboard that was loading so slow before, you can see that information straight away directly from the console, and you would see the error coming through your webhook straight away from the Azure portal interface, and you would know what's gone wrong in your execution. Yeah, okay. I would just end the presentation with this because it's not not loading so fast. I hope you learned something new, and if you have some questions, feel free to ask. Unmute yourself, drop in some in chat, and I didn't see if there are any questions in chat. Can Raz do
Yeah,
some? Yeah.
yeah. So there were a few questions and actually a debate going on. And people have responded back and forth in the chat. For one of the question, there is an option of using service bus and also webhooks. So what is your perspective on the, like, what do you prefer and when? You know?
Okay, so event hubs, I use event hubs when I need asynchronous processing. You can make that push events synchronous in the event hub. So if you want to do something straight away, you would need to use webhooks. But if you have a lot of data coming through your system and triggering all the sorts of events, I would go to asynchronous method. If you can use the asynchronous method and use the event hub for in that example. Any other questions?
Yes, so there was another question from Mukesh, and the question is, I have registered a webhook on create of a project record synchronously. If the Azure function fails, oh, I think that you already responded. Never mind.
Yeah,
That was
yeah.
already responded in the chat. Um, yeah, so this question is from Kim. Can you secure your Azure functions with AD OAuth and still use webhook trigger?
You can put the Azure Management API on top of your Azure functions, secure them with all the methods out there that you can secure your endpoints. But at the moment, the only thing that configuration allows you is to use headers. So if you can implement your security and pass that information via header, you can do it. But if it's some user access flow or something like that, sadly, you can't do that right now.
Yeah, I think so. That was it.
Okay. Any other questions? We have a minute or two.
Yeah, I mean, I've never heard of this NG Rock, and it was awesome seeing the demo. Even very much thankful for you to showing us this tool, amazing tool. And if you read through the chat, everyone is just praising that tool and praising you and how you